8. Transport in mammals. As animals become larger, more complex and more active transport systems become essential to supply nutrients to, and remove waste from, individual cells. Mammals are far more active than plants and require much greater supplies of oxygen. This is transported by hemoglobin inside red blood cells. 8.1 The circulatory system. Large organisms need circulatory system to connect all living cells to the organs that exchange vital materials. Diffusion alone is not enough. Mammals have a double circulation, the pulmonary circulation to the lungs and the systemic circulation to the rest of the body. A comparison of arteries, veins and capillaries, vessel cross-section, direction of flow, pressure, oxygen content, size of lumen, presence of valves, properties of wall, arteries away from heart. High relatively small, no tough, powerful elastic recoil, veins back to heart, low relatively large, yes thin, distend easily, capillaries through organs, medium, oxygen lost through wall. Small, about the diameter of one red blood cell. No one cell thick, permeable. 8.1 to 1 Mammalian circulatory system, closed double circulation consisting of heart, blood and blood vessels, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules and veins. The mammalian heart is a four-chambered muscular pump made of cardiac muscle. This can contract powerfully and without fatigue. Arterioles, arteries branch into smaller vessels called arterioles. Both arteries and arterioles are very flexible. They get bigger or smaller to help maintain your body's blood pressure. Venules, veins begin as tiny vessels called venules and get gradually larger as they near your heart. Venules receive blood from capillaries. Blood vessels, arteries, in red, carry oxygen-rich blood from the left side of the heart to the tissues and organs. After oxygen leaves the blood and moves into the tissues, the level of oxygen in the blood becomes low. The veins, in blue, carry blood that has a low level of oxygen back to the right side of the heart. Blood from the veins is pumped from the right side of the heart through the blood vessels of the lungs, where new oxygen is picked up. This oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the left side of the heart. 8.1 to 2 Functions of the main blood vessels. Blood leaves the capillary and enters the small venules. These venules become progressively larger vessels called veins. The vena cava are the two largest veins that carry blood into the right upper chamber of the heart, the right atrium. The superior vena. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 03004610-457. Cava carries blood from the brain and arms into the top of the right atrium. The inferior vena cava carries blood from the legs and abdominal cavity into the bottom of the right atrium. Pulmonary arteries carry oxygen-poor blood, deoxygenated blood, away from the right ventricle to the lungs. Pulmonary veins carry oxygen-rich blood, oxygenated blood, from the lungs to the left atrium of the heart. Pulmonary artery and aorta are the two great vessels that carry blood out of the heart from right ventricle with comparatively low pressure. A crucial difference is that the pulmonary artery carries oxygen-poor, deoxygenated, blood, while aorta carries oxygen-rich, oxygenated, blood from the left ventricle with great pressure. Mass transport in mammals occurs through the arteries, arterioles, and veins. 8.1 to 3 Arteries, veins and capillaries, photomicrographs. 8.1 to 4 Structure and functions of arteries, veins and capillaries. Arteries, these strong, muscular blood vessels carry oxygen-rich blood from your heart to your body. They handle a large amount of force and pressure from your blood flow but don't carry a large volume of blood. At any given time, only about 10% to 15% of your body's blood is in your arteries. Capillaries, these tiny blood vessels have thin walls. Oxygen and nutrients from the blood can move through the walls and get into organs and tissues. The capillaries also take waste products away from your tissues. Capillaries are where oxygen and nutrients are exchanged for carbon dioxide and waste. Veins, unlike arteries, veins don't have to carry highly pressurized blood, but they do have to carry large volumes of deoxygenated blood back to your heart. Thin, less elastic walls help them handle high volumes and low pressure. Most veins have valves that open and close. The valves control blood flow and keep your blood flowing in one direction. About 75% of your blood is in your veins. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. 8.1-5 Recognition of red blood cells, monocytes, neutrophils and lymphocytes from photomicrographs and electron micrographs. Monocytes, they have a longer lifespan than many white blood cells and help to break down bacteria. Lymphocytes, they create antibodies to fight against bacteria, viruses, and other potentially harmful invaders. Neutrophils, they kill and digest bacteria and fungi. They are the most numerous type of white blood cell and your first line of defense when infection strikes. Basophils, these small cells seem to sound an alarm when infectious agents invade your blood. They secrete chemicals, such as histamine, a marker of allergic disease, that help control the body's immune response. Eosinophils, they attack and kill parasites and cancer cells, and help with allergic responses. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. Red blood cells are relatively small cells. They have a biconcave shape and no nucleus. Their cytoplasm is full of hemoglobin. Red blood cells carry oxygen in combination with hemoglobin, while blood cells include phagocytes and lymphocytes. They all have nuclei, and are either spherical or irregular in shape. 8.1-6 Water, the main component of blood and tissue fluid, structure and functions related to transport in mammals. Blood plasma leaks from capillaries to form tissue fluid. Plasma constitutes 55% of total blood volume, composed of 90% water, salts, lipids and hormones. It is especially rich in proteins, including its main protein albumin, immunoglobulins, clotting factors and fibrinogen. 8.1-7 Structure and functions of tissue fluid. It comes from substances that leak out of blood capillaries, the smallest type of blood vessel. It helps bring oxygen and nutrients to cells and to remove waste products from them. As new tissue fluid is made, it replaces older fluid, which drains towards lymph vessels. Tissue fluid is formed from blood plasma leaking out of capillaries via tiny holes in the capillary endothelium. Plasma proteins, however, cannot fit through capillaries, so they are absent from the tissue fluid. Besides transporting oxygen, O2, and nutrients to cells, tissue fluid also removes waste products. Tissue fluid is a fluid found in the spaces around cells, and it comes from substances that leak out of blood capillaries. Tissue fluid facilitates substance exchange between cells and the blood by helping bring oxygen and nutrients to cells, and removing waste products from them as well. As the body has intrinsic mechanisms to regulate the composition of blood plasma, i.e., homeostasis, tissue fluid has a mostly constant environment. In other words, the composition of tissue fluid is stable without much variation. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. The main constituents of plasma components function proteins, albumin antibodies fibrinogen. Osmotic balance immunity blood clotting salts, sodium, potassium, chloride, hydrogen caronate, calcium osmotic balance, conduction of nerve impulses, carriage of CO2, buffering, blood clotting products of digestion, glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, glycerol, vitamins, nourishment of cells. Hormones, protein, e.g. insulin, lipid, steroids, e.g. testosterone, communication. Heat distributed around body to maintain constant body temperature, oxygen vital in aerobic cell respiration, waste products, urea, CO2 none, they must be removed by excretion. 8.2 Transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Oxygen is carried both physically dissolved in the blood and chemically combined to hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is carried physically dissolved in the blood, chemically combined to blood proteins as carbamino compounds, and as bicarbonate. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. 8.2 to 1 Role of red blood cell in transporting oxygen with reference to the role of hemoglobin, carbonic anhydrase, the formation of hemoglobinic acid and the formation of carbaminohemoglobin. There are three means by which carbon dioxide is transported in the bloodstream from peripheral tissues and back to the lungs: 1. Dissolved gas, 2. Bicarbonate, and 3. Carbaminohemoglobin bound to hemoglobin and other proteins. 8.2 to 2 Chloride shifts and its importance. The chloride shift is an exchange of ions that takes place in our red blood cells in order to ensure that no buildup of electric change takes place during gas exchange. Within our tissues, the cells produce a bunch of carbon dioxide molecules that are ultimately expelled by the cell and travel to the blood plasma. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. 8.2 to 3 The role of plasma in the transport of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide dissolves directly into the blood plasma to be carried to the lungs where it will be exhaled. Carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin as red blood cells pass through the tissues and is released as the blood cells reach the lungs. Carbon dioxide converts into bicarbonate ions in the blood as it diffuses from the tissues and then converts back to carbon dioxide as it reaches the lungs to be exhaled. 8.2 to 4 Description of oxygen dissociation curve of adult hemoglobin. Hemoglobin picks up oxygen at high partial pressures, concentrations, of oxygen in the lungs and releases it at low partial pressures of oxygen in respiring tissues. A graph showing the percentage saturation of hemoglobin at different partial pressures of oxygen is known as a dissociation curve. At high carbon dioxide concentrations, the dissociation curve shifts downwards and to the right, showing that hemoglobin releases oxygen more easily when carbon dioxide concentration is high. This is known as the Bohr shift. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. 8.2 to 5 Importance of oxygen dissociation curve at partial pressures of oxygen in the lungs and respiring tissues. Introduction. The oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve is a vital tool for comprehending how blood transports and releases oxygen. Oxygen is carried throughout the body primarily by a protein molecule, hemoglobin, which is present inside red blood cells. Oxygen can also be carried throughout the body by dissolving in blood plasma, but this dissolved portion only constitutes a small portion of the total amount of oxygen transported in the bloodstream. Only 2% of oxygen in the bloodstream is dissolved directly in the plasma component of blood compared to 98% of oxygen in the protein-bound state to hemoglobin. It is important to note the difference between oxygen saturation, SA2, which is the percentage of hemoglobin bound to oxygen, and partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, PaO2, which is the amount of oxygen dissolved in the blood. The oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve helps describe the relationship between these two important concepts. Mechanism. Hemoglobin, Hb, molecule is the combination of protein globin and non-protein portion called heme and responsible for essentially transporting of the oxygen in the blood. Hemoglobin is composed of 4 subunits, 2 alpha subunits and 2 beta subunits, each of which contains a heme group and globin chain. The heme group contains an iron atom as ferrous form, Fe2+, at its core that binds one oxygen molecule, allowing one hemoglobin tetramer to bind 4 oxygen molecules. Hemoglobin exists in 2 states, the T, deoxygenated tense, state and the R, oxygenated relaxed, state. The 2 states differ in their affinity to bind oxygen. In an unbound state, hemoglobin exists in the T state, and binding of oxygen occurs with low affinity. The T state hemoglobin thus requires a higher partial pressure of oxygen, P2, to facilitate the binding of an oxygen molecule. The binding of single oxygen induces a conformational change that destabilizes the T state and facilitates the transition of the other subunits to the high affinity R state. The binding of the first oxygen allows the second, third, and fourth oxygen molecules to subsequently bind with increasing ease. This relationship is an example of positive cooperativity. In a set of normal lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is naturally high at the alveolar capillary junction. Therefore, exposing the T-state hemoglobin to vast amounts of oxygen facilitating oxygen loading. This process occurs very quickly and allows for hemoglobin to saturate to 100% before the end of the capillary bed. Upon exiting the pulmonic system, the hemoglobin is now in the oxygenated R state. However, the partial pressure of oxygen is naturally lower in peripheral tissue, which aids in the release of oxygen. In the peripheral tissue, the T state of hemoglobin is preferred as there are a lower P2 and less oxygen bound, which results in a quick release of the other 3 molecules of oxygen. Throughout the bloodstream, there are different P2 levels that participate in a continuous equilibrating transition between T and R states. Lecture notes for AS level biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 03004610-457. The relationship between P2 and SAW2 can be represented by the oxygen dissociation curve, which represents oxygen saturation, y-axis, as a function of the partial pressure of oxygen, x-axis. The sigmoid or S-shape of the curve is due to the positive cooperativity of hemoglobin. In the pulmonary capillaries, the partial pressure of oxygen is high, allowing more molecules of oxygen to bind hemoglobin until reaching the maximum concentration. At this point, little additional binding occurs and the curve flattens out, representing hemoglobin saturation. At the systemic capillaries, P2 is lower and can result in large amounts of oxygen released by hemoglobin for metabolically active cells, which is represented by a steeper slope of the dissociation curve. Clinical significance. The strength by which oxygen binds to hemoglobin is affected by several factors and can be represented as a shift to the left or right in the oxygen dissociation curve. A rightward shift of the curve indicates that hemoglobin has a decreased affinity for oxygen, thus, oxygen actively unloads. A shift to the left indicates increased hemoglobin affinity for oxygen and an increased reluctance to release oxygen. Several physiologic factors are responsible for shifting the curve left or right, such as pH, carbon dioxide, CO2, temperature, and 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. pH. A decrease in pH, acidity, shifts the dissociation curve to the right, while an increase in pH, alkalinity, shifts the dissociation curve to the left. At greater concentrations of hydrogen ions, hemoglobin stabilizes in the deoxygenated T state. Therefore, as the pH decreases, and the CO2 increases, the hemoglobin affinity for oxygen will decrease. This inverse relationship is known as the Bohr effect and is evident when metabolically active tissue metabolizes glucose and oxygen into CO2 and organic acids. The hemoglobin then has a reduced affinity to oxygen and helps to deliver it to tissues in need. Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide affects the curve in two ways: the Bohr effect and through the accumulation of carbamino compounds that are generated by chemical interactions. These compounds form carbamino hemoglobin, which in return stabilizes the T state, lowers affinity for oxygen, and induces oxygen unloading. Only a small portion of carbon dioxide gets transported in this manner. The majority of carbon dioxide is carried in the bicarbonate buffer system. Upon entrance into red blood cells, carbon dioxide is quickly converted to carbonic acid by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic acid immediately dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. As previously stated, an increase in hydrogen ions stabilize the hemoglobin in the T state and induces oxygen unloading, which leads to shifting of the dissociation curve to the right. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 03004610-457. 2,3-diphosphoglycerate, DPG. 2,3-diphosphoglycerate, DPG, is an intermediate product of glycolysis that is produced within the red blood cell that affects hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. High concentrations of 2,3-DPG will shift the dissociation curve to the right, whereas low concentrations will shift the curve to the left. The relationship of hydrogen ions is inversely proportionate with levels of 2,3-DPG, which stating that an elevation of the hydrogen ion concentration in red blood cells will result in decreases in 2,3-DPG and vice versa. This is evident at high altitudes where lower oxygen levels induce hyperventilation, causing PCO2 and hydrogen ions to decrease, which leads to leftward shifting of the dissociation curve. This left shift leads to an increase in red blood cell production of 2,3-DPG, which leads to shifting the curve back to the right and establishes an essential mechanism of respiratory compensation. Temperature. The effect of temperature on the curve is relatively straightforward. Oxygen unloading is favored at higher temperatures, which will cause a rightward shift. On the other hand, lower temperatures will cause a leftward shift in the dissociation curve. A notable example of this is exercise, where the temperature of muscle increases secondary to its utilization, thus shifting the curve to the right and allowing oxygen to be more easily unloaded from hemoglobin and delivered to tissues in need. Carbon monoxide. Hemoglobin binds carbon monoxide, CO, 200 to 300 times more than with oxygen, resulting in the formation of carboxyhemoglobin and preventing the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin due to the competition of the same binding sites. The binding of one CO molecule to hemoglobin increases the affinity of the other binding spots for oxygen, leading to a left shift in the dissociation curve. This shift prevents oxygen unloading in peripheral tissue, and therefore the oxygen concentration of the tissue is much lower than normal. Thus, in the presence of carbon monoxide, a person can experience severe tissue hypoxia while maintaining a normal PaO2. Patients with CO poisoning experience symptoms such as headache, malaise, altered mental status, shortness of breath, seizures, or cherry red lips. A pulse oximeter would usually be normal because the machine is unable to detect carboxyhemoglobin from oxyhemoglobin. Fetal hemoglobin, HbF, is structurally different than adult hemoglobin because it is composed of 2 alpha and 2 gamma chains. The gamma chains of HbF have a reduced affinity for 2,3-DPG, thus allowing HbF to have a higher affinity for oxygen at lower levels of partial pressure and resulting in a leftward shift of the dissociation curve. This state is advantageous in the womb, as the fetus can pull oxygen from maternal circulation with greater ease. At the level of the placenta, 2,3-DPG interacts more readily with adult hemoglobin, inducing oxygen unloading. Whereas, fetal hemoglobin is unaffected by the 2,3-DPG and can bind oxygen easily. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. 8.2 to 6 Description of Bohr shift. The oxyhemoglobin Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. Capillaries are important in metabolic exchange and in the formation of tissue fluid. Red cells, erythrocytes, in the blood transport oxygen. White cells in the blood are involved in protecting the body from disease. The heart cycle consists of the atrial systole, the ventricular systole, and the diastole. Exercise increases cardiac output and affects the distribution of blood to the different organs in the body. Types of leukocyte appearance function. Lymphocyte nucleus has large, round nucleus and a relatively small amount cytoplasm. Some types of lymphocytes secrete antibodies. Others have different functions, such as killing infected cells and controlling aspects of the immunological process. Monocyte nucleus has a large, kidney-shaped nucleus. These cells engulf bacteria. Granulocyte nucleus possess a lobed nucleus and granular cytoplasm. Granulocytes have a number of different functions, some engulf bacteria and others are involved with allergies and inflammation. 8.3 to 1 External and internal structure of the mammalian heart. 8.3 to 2 Difference in thickness of the walls of atria and ventricles, left ventricle and right ventricle. The mammalian heart has 4 chambers, right and left atria and right and left ventricles. The right side of the heart is divided from the left by a wall of tissue called the septum. The atrial muscular walls are thin and do not exert much pressure when they contract. The ventricular walls are much more muscular and exert a sufficient pressure to drive blood to the lungs from the right ventricle and around the rest of the body from the left ventricle. The left ventricular wall is therefore much thicker and more muscular than the right ventricular wall. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. 8.3 to 3 Cardiac cycle with reference to relationship between blood pressure changes during systole and diastole and the opening and closing of valves. The cardiac cycle is a continuous process but can be considered in 3 stages. 1. Atrial systole, contraction of the atria, allows blood to flow into the ventricles from the atria. Closure of valves in the veins prevents backflow of blood into the veins. 2. Ventricular systole, contraction of the ventricles, pushes blood into the arteries by forcing open the semilunar valves. Blood is prevented from flowing back into the atria by pressure closing the atrioventricular valves. In diastole, relaxation of heart muscle, the semilunar valves are pushed shut, preventing backflow of blood from the arteries into the ventricles. Blood flows into the atria and ventricles from the veins. 8.3 to 4 Roles of the sinoatrial node. The atrioventricular node and the Purkinje tissue in the cardiac cycle. Beating of the heart is initiated by the sinoatrial node, SAN, or pacemaker, which has its own myogenic rhythm. A wave of excitation spreads across the atria so all the heart muscle cells in the atria contract together. The wave of excitation cannot spread to the ventricles directly because of a band of non-conducting tissue. However, the atrioventricular node, AVN, in the septum passes the wave to the Purkinje tissue, which then causes the ventricles to contract from the bottom up shortly after the atria. It carries the impulse generated by the SA node from the atria into the ventricles. This is important because it pushes the blood upwards out of the ventricles into the arteries. The heart is myogenic. The sinoatrial node, SAN, begins each heartbeat by generating an electrical signal. Key words. Circulatory system, closed circulatory system, diastole, double circulatory system, elastic arteries, hemoglobin, hemoglobinic acid, hydrostatic pressure, inferior vena cava, left ventricle, lymphocytes, monocytes, muscular artery, neutrophils, oncotic pressure, oxygen dissociation curve, plasma, pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins, Purkinje tissue, red blood cells, erythrocytes, right ventricle, semilunar valves, septum, sinoatrial node, SAN, solvent. Specific heat capacity, superior vena cava, tissue fluid, tricuspid valves, vein, ventricle, ventricular systole, venule. Chapter Glossary. Circulatory system is the transport system in animals. Closed circulatory system is a circulatory system in which the blood pumped by the heart is contained within blood vessels. The blood does not come into direct contact with the cells. Closed circulatory systems are found in animals, e.g. vertebrates. Diastole is the stage of the cardiac cycle in which the heart muscle relaxes. The atria and ventricles fill with blood. The AV valves are open. Double circulatory system is a circulatory system in which the blood flows through the heart twice in 2 circuits. Blood is pumped from the heart to the lungs before returning to the heart. It is then pumped around the body, after which it returns to the heart again. Double circulatory systems are found in mammals. Elastic arteries are large vessels that receive blood directly from the heart at high pressure. They contain large numbers of collagen and elastic fibers. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 030046100457. Hemoglobin is the red pigment found in erythrocytes that binds reversibly with 4 oxygen molecules to form oxyhemoglobin. It is a globular protein that consists of 4 polypeptide chains, each with a prosthetic heme group. Hemoglobinic acid is the product formed when hemoglobin accepts free hydrogen ions. This enables hemoglobin to act as a buffer which reduces changes in blood pH. Hydrostatic pressure is the pressure exerted on the sides of a vessel by a fluid. Inferior vena cava is the vein that returns deoxygenated blood to the heart from the lower body. Left ventricle is the chamber of the heart that receives oxygenated blood from the left atrium and pumps it through the aorta around the body. The left ventricle is thicker than the right ventricle as it must pump blood further at a higher pressure. Lymphocytes are white blood cells that contribute to the specific immune response, e.g. B lymphocytes can differentiate to produce antibodies. Monocytes are white blood cells that become tissue macrophages and perform phagocytosis. Muscular artery is a medium-sized vessel that takes blood from an elastic artery and branches into smaller arteries and arterioles. Muscular arteries contain large amounts of smooth muscle. Neutrophils are white blood cells with a multilobed nucleus that perform phagocytosis and release chemicals which contribute to fever and inflammation. Oncotic pressure is the movement of water into the blood by osmosis due to the tendency of plasma proteins to lower the water potential of the blood. Oxygen dissociation curve is a graph that describes the relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen and the percentage saturation of hemoglobin in the blood. Plasma is the main component of the blood that carries red blood cells. It is a yellow liquid that contains proteins, nutrients, mineral ions, hormones, dissolved gases and waste. Pulmonary arteries are the arteries that carry deoxygenated blood away from the heart to the lungs. Pulmonary veins are the veins that carry oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. Purkinje tissue are specialized cardiac muscle fibers which make up the bundle of His and conduct the wave of excitation through the septum from the AVN down to the apex of the ventricles. Red blood cells, erythrocytes, is a type of blood cell that is anucleate and biconcave. It contains hemoglobin which enables the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from the tissues. Right ventricle is the chamber of the heart that receives deoxygenated blood from the right atrium and pumps it through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. The right left ventricle as it pumps blood a shorter distance at a lower pressure. Semilunar valves are two pairs of valves found between the ventricles and arteries. They prevent the backflow of blood from the arteries into the ventricles. Septum as the wall of muscle which separates the left side of the heart from the right side of the heart, preventing oxygenated and deoxygenated blood from mixing. Sinoatrial node, SAN, is a group of cells in the wall of the right atrium that generate electrical activity, causing the atria to contract. The SAN is often referred to as the heart's pacemaker. Solvent is a substance which other solutes are dissolved in. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 030046100457. Specific heat capacity is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of a substance by a specific amount. Superior vena cava is the vein that returns deoxygenated blood to the heart from the head and upper body. Tissue fluid is the fluid that surrounds the cells of animals. It has the same composition as plasma but does not contain red blood cells or plasma proteins. Tricuspid valves are the atrioventricular valves found between the right atrium and right ventricle. Vein is a type of blood vessel that carries blood towards the heart under low pressure. It has a wide lumen, a smooth inner lining and valves. The walls of the veins contain smooth muscle, large amounts of collagen and little elastic fiber. Ventricle is chamber of the heart which receives blood from the atria. Ventricular systole is the stage of the cardiac cycle in which the ventricles contract, pushing blood into the arteries. The semilunar valves are pushed open fully. Venule is a type of blood vessel that connects the capillaries and veins. The walls of the venules contain small amounts of collagen and smooth muscle. Short MCQs with right answers. 1. 28. The photomicrograph shows blood cells as seen using a high-power light microscope. 2. Which row correctly identifies the different types of white blood cell? 3. 29 planned diagrams of two blood vessels are shown. 4. Which labels are correct? 5. 30 What are found in blood and tissue fluid? 1 carbon dioxide, 2 fatty acids, 3 white blood cells, 4 protein, 6. 31 Which reactions would be slowed down by an inhibitor of carbonic anhydrase? 7. 32 Which sequence of letters correctly identifies the order of events during the cardiac cycle? Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 030046100457. 8. 33 The diagram gives information about blood pressure in the left side of the heart during the cardiac cycle. 9. Valves open and close at the points numbered. Which row identifies the valves opening or closing at the points numbered? 10. 33 The diagram shows some of the events that happen between the plasma and the red blood cells in the circulatory system. 11. What do the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 represent? Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 030046100457. 12. 34 The diagrams show the valves in the heart when viewed in cross-section from above at different stages in the cardiac cycle. 13. Which stages in the cardiac cycle are shown? 14. 33 What is present in the blood in human veins? 1 chloride ions, 2 carbonic anhydrase, 3 oxyhemoglobin, 15. 34 The photomicrograph shows 2 blood vessels P and Q. Both these blood vessels are part of a network which transports blood around the body. 16. 17. Which row is correct for blood vessel P and blood vessel Q? 18. 19. 35 The diagram shows a blood capillary and the tissue fluid which surrounds it. 20. 21. Tissue fluid is formed when fluid and solutes from blood plasma pass through tiny gaps in the capillary wall. Most tissue fluid is then returned to the blood in the capillary. Which pressures will be needed at points W, X, Y, and Z so that this system can function? Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 030046100457. 22, 23. 36 What happens during ventricular systole in a mammalian heart? Aortic pressure increases. 24, 31 The photomicrograph shows a section through a tissue with an artery. Which row correctly shows the type of artery and whether the blood inside the artery is oxygenated or deoxygenated? 25, 26. Which row correctly shows the type of artery and whether the blood inside the artery is oxygenated or deoxygenated? 27, 28. 32 Heart surgery may cause a decrease in the transmission of impulses in the Purkinje tissue to the right side of the heart. What is a possible effect of this decrease? The muscle of the right ventricle would contract slightly more slowly than the muscle of the left ventricle. 29. 33 The diagram shows a network of blood vessels that supply blood to muscle tissue in the human body. 30. 31. What is a correct comparison between the blood at X and the blood at Y when the muscle tissue is at rest? 32. 33. 34 Scientists have shown that the oxygen dissociation curves for hemoglobin of smaller mammals are to the right of those of larger mammals. What does this suggest about the hemoglobin of smaller mammals? It releases oxygen more easily than the hemoglobin of larger mammals. 34. Why is the mammalian circulatory system described as a double circulation? Blood flows twice through the heart in one complete circuit of the body. 35. Humans have a double circulation system. What does the term double circulation mean? The blood passes twice through the heart during one complete circulation. 36. Which statement correctly links muscular or elastic arteries to their functions? Elastic arteries expand when the heart contracts and then recoil as the heart relaxes to maintain pressure. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 03004610457. 37. Which row correctly identifies the pulmonary artery? Thickness of blood vessel wall / mm, 1.30, oxygen content of blood inside vessel, deoxygenated, blood pressure / mmHg, 15 to 30. 38. Which components are found in arteries? Endothelium, smooth muscle and collagen. 39. Which are present in the walls of veins? Endothelium, smooth muscle, elastic tissue and collagen fibers. 40. Which are present in the arteries? Endothelium, smooth muscle, elastic tissue and collagen fibers. 41. Which are present in the walls of capillaries? Only endothelium, no smooth muscle, no elastic tissue and no collagen fibers. 42. Which statements about blood vessels are correct? 1. Collagen fibers in the walls of arteries and veins prevent overstretching. 2. Elastic fibers in large arteries allow stretching during ventricular systole. 3. Smooth muscle controls the distribution of blood to different parts of the body. 43. Which factors affect blood pressure? 1. Diameter of the blood vessels. 2. The systolic pressure of the heart ventricles. 3. The volume of the blood returning to the heart in each cardiac cycle. 44. The large arteries close to the heart have a thick elastic layer in their walls. Which statements about this layer are correct? 1. Helps to maintain the blood pressure in arteries. 2. Prevents too much pressure bursting the artery wall. 45. A number of different tissues occur in the walls of major blood vessels. Which row correctly identifies the main tissues found in the 3 layers of the walls of an artery? Outer layer, tunica externa collagen, middle layer, tunica media elastic, inner layer, tunica intima endothelium 46. Which of the following are the components in an artery and vein? Collagen fibers, elastic fibers, endothelial cells and smooth muscle cells. 47. Which of the tissue types are present in the walls of all blood vessels? Endothelial tissue 48. Which statement about the pulmonary artery is correct? It contains blood at high pressure. 49. What is present in the blood in human veins? Carbonic anhydrase and oxyhemoglobin. 50. Small arteries, arterioles, are found near tissues. One function of an arteriole is to increase or decrease the flow of blood to the tissues. Which tissues would be present in an arteriole wall to allow this function? Muscle 51. Which row is correct for the pulmonary vein? Blood carried is oxygenated, muscles involved are thin and lumen size is large. 52. Which features allow an artery to resist changes in the pressure of blood flowing through it? Thick elastic layer in the artery wall and thick layer of muscle in the artery wall. 53. The pressure of the blood entering capillaries is about 7 times higher than that of blood leaving the capillaries. What correctly explains this observation? 1. Blood pressure decreases with distance from the heart. 2. Tissue fluid formation is due to a net loss of plasma from capillaries. 54. Which row is correct for the location of a type of molecule or cell? Type of molecule or cell, lymphocytes, blood, yes, lymph, yes, tissue fluid, yes 55. Which process can be carried out by a mature red blood cell? Active transport 56. Which are correct statements about phagocytes? 1. They are white blood cells with a lobed nucleus. 2. They have many lysosomes containing hydrolytic enzymes. 3. They have any mitochondria to produce ATP for endocytosis. 57. What is not a factor influencing blood pressure? The number of red blood cells in circulation. 58. What is found in all blood vessels, lymph and tissue fluid? Carbon dioxide, glucose, white blood cells and antibodies. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 030046100457. 59. Which row correctly identifies components of both lymph and tissue fluid? Antibodies, yes. Red blood cells, no. Sodium ions, yes. White blood cells, yes. 60. Which components of blood are present in lymph? White blood cells, proteins and sodium ions. 61. Which row correctly identifies the locations in which a type of molecule or cell is present? Antibody is found in blood, lymph and tissue fluid. 62. Which row correctly identifies the molecules or cells that are present in the different locations? Phagocytes are found in blood, lymph and tissue fluid. 63. Blood, tissue fluid and lymph each have a different composition. Which row shows the composition of lymph? Lymph has water, antibodies, and lipid. 64. Which statement correctly compares blood plasma and tissue fluid in a healthy person? Blood plasma contains more proteins than tissue fluid. 65. Which components of blood are present in lymph? White blood cells, proteins and sodium ions. 66. Which components of blood are present in tissue fluid? Phagocytes, proteins and sodium ions. 67. Which components of blood are present in tissue fluid? Glucose proteins and white blood cells. 68. Which statements are correct? 1. Tissue fluid has less protein and no red blood cells compared to plasma. 2. Lymph may contain lipids, carbon dioxide and phagocytes. 3. Tissue fluid contains glucose, amino acids, urea and carbon dioxide. 69. What is correct for tissue fluid? Have phagocytes, no platelets, lower protein concentration compared to blood plasma. 70. Which of the following are found in blood, lymph and tissue fluid? Carbon dioxide, glucose, white blood cells, proteins and fatty acids. 71. Which statement correctly identifies a similarity between blood plasma and tissue fluid? White blood cells are found in both blood plasma and tissue fluid. 72. Which will not be formed in the plasma in capillaries surrounding active tissue? Carbaminohemoglobin. 73. Which of the following are found in all blood vessels, lymph and tissue fluid? Carbon dioxide, glucose, white blood cells and antibodies. 74. Which reactions take place in the capillaries surrounding alveolus? 1. Hemoglobinic acid hemoglobin plus hydrogen ions. 2. Hydrogen carbonate ions plus hydrogen ions carbonic acid carbon dioxide plus water. 75. Which reactions take place in a capillary in the lungs? Carbon dioxide and water are formed from hydrogen carbonate ions and hydrogen ions. 76. What is the main reaction occurring in blood capillaries at the gas exchange surface in a human lung? Carbon dioxide is produced from hydrogen carbonate ions by carbonic anhydrase. 77. When active tissues have high carbon dioxide concentration, oxyhemoglobin needs to release oxygen to the tissues. How is the carbon dioxide transported away by the blood from the tissues? As carbaminohemoglobin and as hydrogen carbonate ions. 78. Which reactions take place in blood that is passing through active tissues? 1. HBO8. HB plus 4022. HBO8 plus H plus HHB plus 4023. H2O plus CO2 H2CO3. 79. What can combine with the heme group of a hemoglobin molecule? Oxygen and carbon monoxide 80. Which mechanism accounts for the way most of the carbon dioxide is transported in blood? Carbon dioxide is converted to hydrogen carbonate ions inside red blood cells. 81. How many times must a molecule of carbon monoxide pass through a cell's surface membrane as it diffuses from an air space in an alveolus, through a cell in the capillary wall into a red blood cell? 5. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 03004610-457. 82. Which substances can combine with adult hemoglobin and reduce the oxygen-carrying capacity of the blood? Carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen ions. 83. What effect does decreasing carbon dioxide concentration have on hemoglobin? It is more efficient at taking up oxygen and less efficient at releasing oxygen. 84. What is correct about the transport of carbon dioxide by blood? 1. The enzyme carbonic anhydrase catalyses the formation of carbonic acid in red blood cells. 2. Carbon dioxide diffuses from active cells to red blood cells and reacts with water. 85. The enzyme carbonic anhydrase catalyses the reaction. Which statements describe the role of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase? 1. To speed up the decrease in pH of blood in the presence of carbon dioxide. 2. To facilitate the Bohr effect in hemoglobin. 3. To speed up the reaction between carbon dioxide and water. 86. When active tissues have high carbon dioxide concentrations, oxyhemoglobin releases oxygen to these tissues. What encourages this release in the presence of high concentrations of carbon dioxide? 1. Oxyhemoglobin dissociates more readily. 2. Hemoglobin needs higher concentrations of oxygen to become saturated. 87. Which statement about oxygen combining with hemoglobin is correct? The second oxygen molecule to combine makes it easier for the third to combine. 88. Which biochemical is formed and what happens to the oxygen dissociation curve of adult hemoglobin when carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin? Biochemical formed. Carbaminohemoglobin, oxygen dissociation curve, shifts to the right. 89. How many layers of cell surface membrane separate an oxygen molecule I the air space of an alveolus from the nearest hemoglobin molecule? 590. Hemoglobin can bind to carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and oxygen. Which statement about the binding sites of hemoglobin is correct? Carbon monoxide and oxygen bind to one site, carbon dioxide binds to a different site. 91. Which row shows the change in concentration of some substances in red blood cells when carbon dioxide diffuses from active cells? Carbonic anhydrase, no change, hydrogen carbonate ions, increase, hydrogen ions, increase 92. What explains how the maximum uptake of oxygen occurs as blood passes through the capillaries of the lungs? Oxyhemoglobin formation increases the capacity of red blood cells to transport oxygen. 93. Which of these statements about the formation of hemoglobinic acid are correct? 1. It can only occur with the dissociation of oxygen from hemoglobin. 2. It removes excess hydrogen ions, preventing blood becoming too acidic. 3. It is linked to the action of carbonic anhydrase. 94. Which effect could be due to a reduced concentration of carbonic anhydrase? Less oxygen is released from oxyhemoglobin for active tissues. 95. Hemoglobin can bind to carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and oxygen. Which gases share a binding site? Carbon monoxide and oxygen. 96. Which substances could displace oxygen from hemoglobin? Carbon monoxide and hydrogen ions. 97. How is most carbon dioxide transported in the blood? As hydrogen carbonate ions. 98. Which statements are correct? 1. The activity of carbonic anhydrase increases the hydrogen ions concentration in blood passing through active tissue. 2. When hemoglobin binds with the hydrogen ions, its affinity for oxygen decreases. 99. scientists have shown that the oxygen dissociation curves for hemoglobin of smaller mammals are to the right of those of larger mammals. What does this suggest about the hemoglobin of smaller mammals? It unloads oxygen more easily. 100. What combines with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin? Carbon dioxide. 101. Which statement about hemoglobin is correct? It can combine with carbon dioxide. 102. Which does not occur when a red blood cell arrives at the alveolus? Hydrogen ions are released from hemoglobinic acid and diffuse out of the red blood cells. Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 03004610-457. 103. Which reactions take place at a higher rate in a capillary in an alveolus than in a capillary in active muscle? Hydrogen carbonate ions plus hydrogen ions carbon dioxide plus water 104. What does not help to maximize uptake of oxygen as blood flows through capillaries in the lungs? Dissociation of carbon dioxide from carboxyhemoglobin allows more hemoglobin to be available for oxygen binding. 105. What happens after carbonic anhydrase has catalyzed a reaction involved in the transport of carbon dioxide? The dissociation of oxyhemoglobin to hemoglobin and oxygen. 106. What explains how the uptake of oxygen is maximized as blood passes through the capillaries of the lungs? Oxyhemoglobin formation increases the capacity of red blood cells to transport oxygen. 107. What is produced by the action of carbonic anhydrase? Hydrogen carbonate ions 108. Which reactions will be taking place in blood in a capillary next to an alveolus? Hb plus 4O2 HbO8. 109. Which is correct about the affinity between hemoglobin and the gases carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and oxygen? Highest affinity, lowest affinity, carbon monoxide, oxygen, carbon dioxide 110. Which statement explains the importance of the chloride shift in red blood cells, RBC? Hydrogen carbonate ions diffuse into plasma from RBC and chloride ions diffuse into RBC to maintain a balance of positive and negative ions. 111. Which of these processes are responsible for the Bohr shift? 1. Carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid. 2. Hemoglobinic acid is formed from the dissociation of carbonic acid. 112. When they remain at high altitudes, the red blood cell count of humans increases. Why does this occur? To maintain transport of oxygen. 113. Which statement describes the effect of increased carbon dioxide concentration of the oxygen dissociation curve of human hemoglobin and its significance? The curve shifts to the right, allowing hemoglobin to offload more oxygen in active tissues. 114. Which statement explains why the oxygen dissociation curve for hemoglobin is S-shaped? The shape of the hemoglobin molecule changes when oxygen binds to it. 115. An increase in carbon dioxide in human blood shifts the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve to the right. What is the explanation for this effect? Increasing the H+ concentration decreases hemoglobin affinity for oxygen. 116. Which statement describes the Bohr effect? In low partial pressure of oxygen and high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen decreases. 117. Which row describes the changes in the properties of hemoglobin as a result of the Bohr effect? Affinity for oxygen by hemoglobin, lower, oxygen dissociates from hemoglobin, more readily 118. Which statement is true for the Bohr effect? The release of oxygen from hemoglobin is more likely at higher partial pressures of carbon dioxide. 119. Which two statements about the Bohr effect are correct? 1. Increasing the partial pressure of oxygen increases the percentage of oxyhemoglobin. 2. In low concentrations of carbon dioxide, hemoglobin has a high affinity for oxygen. 120. Some babies are born with a hole between the right and left atria. These babies are found to have an increased number of red blood cells. What is the reason for this increase? There is less oxygen available to the newly born baby. 121. Which row is correct for the pulmonary artery? Blood carried, deoxygenated, muscle in walls, thick, lumen size, small 122. Aortic stenosis is a heart valve disorder in which the aortic semilunar valve opening is narrow. Which effect could aortic stenosis have on heart structure and function? The Lecture Notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 03004610-457. Wall of the left ventricle thickens, leading to an enlarged heart and inability to relax and fill completely during diastole. 123. Which events occur during ventricular systole? 1. Atrioventricular valves close. 2. Semilunar valves open. 124. What occurs during ventricular systole in a mammalian heart? 1. Aortic pressure increases. 2. Ventricular pressure increases 125. What is systolic blood pressure? The maximum blood pressure in the arteries. 126. The maximum pressure in each of the 4 chambers of a healthy human heart was recorded during one cardiac cycle. The maximum pressures recorded were 3 mm of mercury, 10 mm of mercury, 25 mm of mercury, and 120 mm of mercury. Which value was recorded for the right ventricle? 25 mm of mercury 127. Which row correctly describes the heart during atrial systole? Wall of ventricle, relaxed, atrioventricular valve, open, semilunar valve, closed 128. What explains why the left and right sides of the heart contract simultaneously? There is no barrier to electrical excitation between 2 sides of the heart. 129. At a certain point in a cardiac cycle, the pressure in the right ventricle is lower than that in the right atrium and lower than that in the pulmonary artery. Which row is correct? Atrioventricular valve, open, semilunar valve, closed 130. What happens during ventricular systole? The atrioventricular valves close and the semilunar valves open. 131. What describes the role of the atrioventricular node of the heart? It delays the transmission of a wave of electrical activity from the sinoatrial node. 132. Which statement about the role in the mammalian circulatory system of the heart, blood vessels and blood is correct? The heart muscle contracts and relaxes, causing blood, carrying materials from one part of the body to another, to move through blood vessels that connect the different parts of the body. 133. If the left atrioventricular valve in the heart does not close completely, it results in blood flowing back into the atrium during ventricular systole. What would be the immediate effect of this backflow? Raised pressure in the left atrium and less blood enters the aorta. 134. Which statement explains why the ventricles contract after the atria? The excitation wave has to pass through a small area of conducting fibers in the septum. 135. Which statement about the blood flow in the cardiac cycle is correct? Blood flows into the right atrium through the vena cava when the wall of the right atrium relaxes. 136. What happens during ventricular systole in a mammalian heart? Aortic pressure increases. 137. 3 areas involved in the control of heart action are listed. In which order are they involved? Sinoatrial node, atrioventricular node, Purkinje tissue 138. Which features enable the aorta to withstand ventricular systole? Collagen fibers and elastin fibers. 139. The contraction of the heart is coordinated through electrical impulses passing through the cardiac muscle. Which is the correct order of part of the sequence of these impulses? Sinoatrial nodes, right and left atria, Purkinje tissue. Atrioventricular nodes. 140. the contraction of the heart is coordinated through electrical impulses passing through the cardiac muscle. What is the correct order of part of the sequence of these impulses? Right and left atria, atrioventricular node, Purkinje tissue, ventricular walls. 141. Which statement concerning events that occur in the heat is correct? As the wave of excitation passes through the atrioventricular node, there is a time delay before it passes down the Purkinje tissue to the ventricles. 142. The following are all parts of the heart that controls the heart action. 1. SAN. 2. AVN. 3. Purkinje tissue. Which row for atrial contraction and ventricular contraction is? Lecture notes for AS Level Biology by Muhammad Rashid Chattha. Cell number 030046100457. Correct? Atrial contraction, SAN, produces wave of excitation, ventricular contraction, Purkinje tissue carries wave of excitation. 143. During the cardiac cycle, the movement of the valves causes sounds that can be heard using a stethoscope. What causes the first sound after atrial systole in the cardiac cycle? Closing of the atrioventricular valves. 144. What occurs during ventricular systole in a mammalian heart? 1. Atrial pressure does not change. 2. Ventricular pressure increases. 145. Heart block is a disease which can result in a lower than normal heart rate. A doctor treating a patient suffering from heart block found that electrical impulses were initiated as normal but were not correctly conducted to the ventricles, so the rate of ventricular contraction was slowed, which may be functioning incorrectly in the patient. Atrioventricular node, AVN, and sinoatrial node, SAN. 146. What correctly describes an event in the cardiac cycle that follows atrial systole? A. Wave of excitation passes through the sinoatrial node, SAN, before spreading down to the base of the septum. 147. Which of the following can result in heart failure? 1. Increase in blood pressure. 2. Deposits of fatty material in arteries and veins. 3. Increased risk of blood clotting. 148. What events occur during contraction of the left ventricle? The pressure in the left ventricle becomes greater than the pressure in the aorta. 149. What happens during ventricular diastole? The atrioventricular valves open. 150. Which chamber of the heart shows the greatest pressure changes during one cardiac cycle? Left ventricle. 151. When one molecule of oxygen combines with hemoglobin, it makes it easier for the next oxygen molecule to bind, which makes it easier for the next molecule of oxygen to bind. Which orders of protein structure change to allow this to happen? Tertiary and quaternary. 152. When climbing a very high mountain, there is a risk of altitude sickness. What causes altitude sickness? Oxygen partial pressure decreases. 153. Which structures are found in both arteries and capillaries? Endothelial cells. 154. Fish oils are thought to have beneficial effects on the conduction of electrical excitation through the ventricles of the heart. What could the fish oils influence? Purkinje tissue. 155. Which event occurs during contraction of the left ventricle? The pressure in the left ventricle becomes greater than the pressure in the aorta. 156. Which characteristics indicate physical fitness? Effect of exercise on pulse rate, slow rise, return of pulse rate to normal, rapid. 157. 4 people of the same age, sex, and mass had their pulse rate taken before and immediately after taking a standard strenuous exercise. Which person has the most well-developed heart muscle? Pulse rate / beats per minute at resting 55 and after exercise 160. 158. In the mammalian heart, which structure is the pacemaker? Sinoatrial node, SAN. 159. The table shows changes occurring in the body. Which combination would cause the greatest rise in cardiac output? Aortic blood pressure, decrease, blood pressure in the vena cava, no change, carbon dioxide concentration of the blood, increase, frequency of impulses in the vagus nerve, no change. Lecture notes for AS level biology by Muhammad Rashid Chatta. Cell number 0300461-0457.